In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Corpse Explosion Necromancer build. This is a full version of the Necromancer Corpse Explosion build that we did for the Diablo 4 betas. This is updated to the full version of the game, so if you're wondering why we're republishing it, it's because it had some changes from what has been changed. And this build is a Beginner Necromancer build that's aimed at World Tiers 1 and 2, capitalizing on the Corpse Explosion skill in order to destroy enemies. The general strategy for this build is to first kill enemies from a distance using Bone Spear and then follow through by detonating their corpses with Corpse Explosion. Alternating back and forth between these two skills will wipe out enemies quickly. Despite the damage nerfs to Corpse Explosion, it continues to be lethal and therefore highly reliable, regardless of the type of enemy you're facing, and it's for this reason that you'll continue to trigger this skill often to deal devastating damage. There are two ways to consistently gain essence for this build, and these are specifically through Decompose and the Grim Harvest passive. Decompose replenishes essence when the affected enemies die. What you'll also want to obtain in relation to this skill is the flesh-rending aspect. Every time you generate a corpse with Decompose, you end up gaining extra essence, allowing you to activate Bone Spear more often. On the other hand, Grim Harvest allows you to gain 9 essence at rank 3 every time you activate Corpse Explosion, so you can replenish this resource and then fire off more Bone Spears without having to use other skills. For elites and bosses, the best way to handle them, in addition to spamming Bone Spear and Corpse Explosion, is by summoning your minions, particularly the Golem. The Golem not only taunts enemies and tanks damage, but also spawns a corpse when its health goes down, so you'll still be able to continue to use Corpse Explosion, even if you don't initially have as many corpses. So you obviously have different strategies with this build depending on whether you're facing a large group of enemies or whether you're facing bosses, and we'll get into the groups of enemies first, and then we'll get more into the details of how to handle bosses. So first, let's take a look at the Decompose skill. Out of all of the basic skills, Decompose generates a lot of essence by default and forms a corpse every 2.5 seconds. Coupled with the flesh-rending aspect, which you get by completing the Nostrava Deepwood dungeon in Fractured Peaks, you restore an extra 10 essence. What's also good is you can cast this skill from a safer distance, especially if you need breathing room between you and your enemies. For upgrades, you want the Enhanced Decompose and Initiate's Decompose passives. Enhanced Decompose allows you to once again regain more essence upon slaying an affected target, whereas Initiate's Decompose inflicts slow. This will synergize well with Corpse Explosion's Plagued Corpse Explosion upgrade, which I'll discuss later. Bone Spear is your bread and butter resource spender for this build. Similar to Decompose, you can hit many enemies with Bone Spear from a safe distance, which will create a lot of corpses, which can then be detonated using Corpse Explosion. You want to max out this skill to make sure it kills enemies, as well as take all the passives, including Supernatural Bone Spear, which makes the first enemy hit by it vulnerable. This is great for elites and bosses who will then take considerable damage from you and your minions. While you're in Fractured Peaks, be sure to finish the Black Asylum dungeon to obtain the aspect of Torment. This will significantly boost your essence regeneration every time you land crits using Bone Spear, so you'll also want to be on the lookout for gear with Critical Strike chance and Critical Strike damage. For passives, you want to invest 1 point into Unliving Energy, which will raise your max essence by a small amount in order to access Imperfectly Balance. When you reach level 26+, you will want to maximize Imperfectly Balance, because although you'll spend more essence, you'll end up amplifying the damage of Bone Spear. Resource generation shouldn't be an issue for this build, since you'll have several effective ways of replenishing it by investing in the right skills, which we mentioned already. And then we come, of course, to Corpse Explosion, the namesake of this build. Once you have some corpses, and usually when you run out of essence, you'll begin using Corpse Explosion to deal explosive AoE damage. This will allow you to finish off enemies that are already weak from your Bone Spears. Since you have the Grim Harvest passive, every time you make use of Corpse Explosion, you'll regenerate some essence. So you can effectively alternate between triggering Bone Spear and Corpse Explosion. After maxing out this skill, you'll also want to gain access to Enhanced Corpse Explosion to further increase its AoE size, and Plagued Corpse Explosion. Plagued Corpse Explosion is taken instead of Blighted Corpse Explosion for this build, since you want to maintain your synergies against vulnerable and slow enemies from Bone Spear and Decompose. As such, those afflicted with these status effects receive greater damage from Corpse Explosion. And then we come to Blood Mist. Blood Mist is a macabre skill which is considered your fail-safe for situations that become tricky to handle. This functions really well because it lets you gain immunity for a short period of time, to be able to create some distance between you and your enemies. But note that you won't be able to use the rest of your skills, and your movement speed will be reduced as well. For Blood Mist's upgrades, you'll be taking the Enhanced Blood Mist passive followed by Ghastly Blood Mist to provide you with an additional 3 corpses. Because you do this, you'll be able to activate Corpse Explosion even when there used to be no corpses at all, in order to deal explosive damage. When it comes to boss fights for this build, you'll have fewer corpses on hand, but you will still generally employ the same strategy. You'll be alternating between Bone Spear and Corpse Explosion while activating Decompose every now and then to generate corpses, as well as replenish your essence. Remember to use Bone Spear until your essence is depleted and then spam Corpse Explosion. As early as level 15, the Necromancer will gain access to the Book of the Dead, which will allow them to raise different minion types. These can be in the form of Skeletal Warriors and Skeletal Mages. For Skeletal Warriors, you want to be selecting the second node of the Reaper's form in Book of the Dead. Doing so will let your minions carve flesh off enemies in order to create a corpse. They don't even have to kill it, just hit it, making this the best option when it comes to generating corpses in boss encounters. Between them and your Golem, Decompose skill, and Blood Mist generating 3 itself, you can still detonate about 7 to 10 corpses every few seconds, which is a lot. For Skeletal Mages, you'll be picking the second node of the cold version. This allows them to apply Vulnerable, provided that they attack or freeze their targets. As a result, your Corpse Explosion will be able to be more effective against them due to the increase in damage provided by Plagued Corpse Explosion on vulnerable enemies. Once you reach level 25 and complete the Call of the Underworld quest, you'll gain access to the Golem minion. For this, you'll want to select the first node of the Bone form to generate a corpse every time the Golem loses 20% of its max health. This will happen most often in boss fights, especially when you constantly activate this skill itself in order to taunt these powerful enemies. Doing so will also let the Golem absorb damage on your behalf so that you remain alive longer. Lastly, remember that many of the stat bonuses from the Book of the Dead have been increased together with the recent boost in minion survivability, so these summons will be more effective for succeeding Necromancer Diablo 4 builds. Final tips. When it comes to bonuses for this gear, you want to look out for Intelligence, Vulnerable Damage, Core Skill Damage, and ranks to Bone Spear and Corpse Explosion. All you really need to benefit this build is Bone Spear and Corpse Explosion damage, but Vulnerable Damage is very good. I do want to note though that while leveling, it's not optimal to try and optimize your gear every time you pick up a new piece of gear that's good for you. You'll simply not have enough materials or gold to continually do this with the speed at which you gain gear in this game, so just be on the lookout for these ones and slot them when you get them. Don't necessarily try and optimize your gear perfectly all the time, or you'll just get yourself bogged down and burnt out. In terms of passives, you want to maximize Imperfectly Balanced, Fueled by Death, and Necrotic Carapace later on. We've discussed Imperfectly Balanced before, so let's focus on the other two. Fueled by Death further boosts the damage of Corpse Explosion, while Necrotic Carapace grants Fortified to you and your minions for each corpse that drops. This is a great skill to help keep you and your summons alive, especially in tough boss fights where there is a lot of damage. You'll be swapping from one better gear to the next at a rapid pace to keep up with the types of enemies you face. It's for this reason that you'll want to save legendary aspects you acquire from legendary items for the end game. Once these are extracted from the equipment and imprinted elsewhere, you won't be able to reuse them in the future. So when it comes to these types of legendary aspects, the good ones to go for at higher levels are the Aspect of Explosive Mist and Blood-Soaked Aspect. The Aspect of Explosive Mist allows you to automatically trigger corpse explosions as long as there are corpses available. It's a massive burst DPS boost since you can detonate corpses very quickly, resulting in chain reaction explosions occurring. Meanwhile, Blood-Soaked Aspect makes your Blood Mist deal more damage and also allows you to move at a normal speed, making it easier to get more corpses before they expire. And lastly, there's the Splintering Aspect, which improves the damage of your Bone Spear splinters while applying Vulnerable to more enemies, making them die faster. Put this on a two-handed weapon to raise its power by 100%. The Splintering Aspect can be acquired when you progress to the dry steps in the campaign. And that wraps up our Corpse Explosion Beginner Necromancer build. I hope you guys found that helpful. Obviously, we'll have World Tier 3 and 4 versions of this build with better equipment, completely optimized as we go through the game. But at the beginning of the game, you just need a way to kind of get on the road to making this build and directions on how to start out. And obviously, your gear is not going to be optimized, and that is what this build is trying to show you how to do. So what do you guys think of Diablo 4 in the Necromancer class? Let me know in the comments below.